Hi, my name is Amanda Trainer, and I'm going to be starting my final screencast for ATM 101, where we are looking at our weather analysis for Valdez versus Northway in the months of January, February, and March. We're going to start with looking at daily changes in temperature in Valdez versus Northway. So I have on here January, February, and March, the maximum, minimums, and temperature ranges. So if we look in Valdez, the temperature ranges are not as great as in Northway. You're looking, in some places it's double. So the difference in the maximum and the minimum temperatures throughout the months doesn't change as much in Valdez as it does in Northway. And that's mostly because Valdez is maritime climate, whereas Northway is continental climate. So Valdez is a more humid area because it's by the water, whereas Northway is more prone to bouts of dryness. So there's less cloud cover there. And we know from our studies that incoming solar radiation can be trapped by the clouds in Valdez, which can help it sustain a more stable climate. And so even if you look at Valdez, it's in the 20s, and then in January, February, and then in March, it just jumps up to barely 40. So there is, about a 20-degree difference. But if we look in Northway, January, and in February, it gets well below zero. And then in March, it jumps up to the 20s and 30s. So there's a bigger jump, which shows us that there is a greater contrast in climate in continental climate versus maritime climate, which can sustain a more stable temperature year-round. Next, we'll look at changes due to air mass. So I pulled up the January, February tables, and so if we look in Valdez versus Northway, Northway is much colder than Valdez in these months of January and February. And then if we look at the pressure systems over here, Valdez experienced a much lower pressure system than Northway, which means that we can conclude that in Northway there was less cloud coverage, which we talked about earlier. So we know that the temperature is going to be much colder in Northway than in Valdez. And also if we look down at the dew point temperatures, we see that Northway's dew points are much lower than Valdez, meaning the air is much more dry, which is something that we would typically see with the high pressure system moving in. In regards to diurnal cycles, I pulled up Valdez and Northway, and we can see we have the temperature in the top part and then the pressure systems in the bottom part, the pressure system indicating the air masses going through. And so these are throughout the day. You can see the tick marks. And so you see the pressure system moves over a longer period of time. In diurnal, it's up and down every day. We can see a peak in the weather in the middle of the day and a drop down. Same throughout all of these. We see where the weather peaks and where it drops down, whereas pressure systems is more over a longer period of time versus every day, versus every 12 hours, as we see with the temperature. As we move on to winds and air mass movement, in January we see a set of lows influencing the sites with east winds and thin clouds over Valdez with moderate humidity. And if we look, those isobars are pretty close together, indicating stronger winds, which is probably why there is low cloud coverage, pushing that cloud coverage out. And then as we move on to March, we see a set of weak lows and the winds are northerly. And over Valdez, we see thick clouds and higher humidity. As you can see, the isobars are spaced out more, indicating lower winds, which will allow the clouds to settle and indicate a more humid climate for Valdez. Moving on to conditions aloft, if we look at this picture, Alaska is lying under a ridge between a trough to the west and a trough to the east, with converging winds aloft over the north and diverging winds aloft over the south, east, and west. And this divergence of air is caused by a cooler, dense air aloft. And as this air is sinking, because it is cooler, it is bringing with it cooler weather. And so that is why we see cooler than normal temperatures at the end of March for this particular set of data. When we talk about effects of global warming in Valdez versus Northway, we were asked to talk about something other than flooding because that's just obvious that Valdez is closer to the coast, so that will happen quickly for Valdez. But I wanted to discuss that I think that Valdez will be much more likely to be affected simply because it is a more humid atmosphere, and we know that the water vapor in the air helps hold in these greenhouse gases, which speeds up the effect of warming the atmosphere. And because there are those mountain ranges between Northway and Valdez, the air when it gets to Valdez, or sorry, when it gets to Northway, is a lot cooler than when it is Valdez. And so I really feel that Valdez is going to experience the effects of global warming before Northway, or at a more intense rate than Northway, just because water pretty much controls the temperature on our Earth. So I really feel like just where Valdez is at, not just because of the flooding, but also because of the water vapor in the air, I feel like it will be more readily affected by global warming than Northway will be.